If you're new to WoW, it can be very daunting to try and figure out which class you should play. For starters, you're faced with a choice of up to 13 different classes you could choose, and each one has a range of ways it can be played. So today I wanted to make a video covering what I think would be the best classes to start off with as a brand new player in World of Warcraft. Do bear in mind that this is just my opinion based on my own experience and gameplay, but if you have your own suggestions of classes or specs that are beginner friendly, be sure to comment them down below. The first thing to figure out when you're choosing a class to play in World of Warcraft is knowing what role you want to fill while playing the game. You can choose between being a tank, a healer, a melee DPS, or a ranged DPS. I'm going to preface this by saying that generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend that a brand new player jumps straight into being a tank or a healer, just because they tend to have more responsibility in a group environment, and when you first start playing WoW, being a DPS gives you more room to learn the ins and outs of the game with a bit less pressure. But if you do want to try being a tank or a healer, I'm going to cover classes for both of these roles too, so you at least have a frame of reference. If you want to play as a tank, protection warriors are a good, safe bet for new players. They don't have too many abilities. The abilities they do have are simple enough to understand and to use in conjunction with other abilities, and they're also just a very typical MMO class to play that is familiar to lots of people. The other tank I think is pretty straightforward is a Guardian Druid, but Druids on the whole are not very beginner friendly because they have so many abilities. They can shapeshift into different creatures that each have their own sets of abilities, plus a bunch of group utility abilities as well. But Guardian Druids take the shape of a bear, and much like Protection Warriors, their toolkit is pretty streamlined and straightforward, and they even share the same resource as warriors called Rage. I've chosen Protection Warrior and Guardian Druid for beginners here because they are both strong in defense, meaning they're good at mitigating damage. Tanks like Blood Death Knights, for example, tend to take much more damage, but they can quickly heal it back. As a beginner, I would recommend sticking with a tank spec that can continuously take a steady amount of damage to save yourself the constant stress of losing all your HP and having to get it all back. Let's move on to healers next, and my number one choice for a new player would have to be a Holy Priest. Holy Priests are, again, a very typical MMO healer, and their toolkit and playstyle is pretty simple. Holy Priests are also great for beginners because they are more of a reactive healer rather than a preemptive healer, in the sense that damage goes out and the Holy Priest heals it, instead of healing prematurely or putting up shields before the damage happens. When you're first learning the game, it may be hard to preempt incoming damage, so choosing a more reactive healing style would be more fitting for a new player in my opinion. Another pretty strong reactive healer is a Restoration Shaman. It might take a bit of practice to perfect how to use your totems and elementals, but otherwise it's a pretty simple spec to play, and they can also offer a good amount of damage in addition to their healing, plus they can grant their team heroism, so they're pretty sought after in group content. As a beginner in WoW, I would avoid the preemptive style healing I mentioned a moment ago, meaning I would not choose to play as a Restoration Druid, as they do the majority of their healing through heal over time abilities, or HOTS, meaning lots of little heals adding up to do lots of healing in total. I would also avoid Discipline Priests because they do the majority of their healing through dealing damage, as well as using lots of preventative abilities like shields, which, with all of those things combined, can be tricky even for experienced players to wrap their heads around. Moving on to DPS, and like I said earlier, DPS is the most recommended role to play as a beginner in WoW because there's less responsibility involved. If you want to be a melee DPS, meaning you fight up close to your target, I would recommend Warrior again as a nice easy class to sink your teeth into while feeling impactful and fun to play. You can choose between being an Arms Warrior or a Fury Warrior. They are both pretty simple to play, so it's just up to you and your playstyle preference. But Fury Warriors do get to equip two two-handed weapons, which is unique to them, and lots of people find that fun on its own. Retribution Paladins are also a pretty safe bet, but they are slightly more complex than Warriors simply because Paladins have a broader toolkit in terms of utility, healing, and so on, meaning you'll have more abilities to manage. but simply from a melee DPS perspective, Retribution Paladins are a good choice in my opinion. I would also say that Enhancement Shaman isn't too bad either, but they are a faster paced spec to play with lots of procs, meaning you'll have abilities lighting up all the time and finishing their cooldowns early, which new players might find confusing. But if you're looking for a melee DPS spec that is more dynamic and, like I say, proc heavy and faster pace, Enhancement Shaman is a strong choice. Lastly, let's look into ranged DPS. In my opinion, ranged DPS is where new players get the best choice of classes to play. Let's start with Hunters, because they would be my overall number one choice of a class to choose as a beginner in WoW for many reasons. Firstly, they can deal damage from ranged, meaning they can stay away from the main combat area to stay alive, but they can also deal damage while moving, which is a very handy tool for a new player who is learning the ropes of how to avoid damage and manage mechanics. Hunters can also tame beasts in the wild to use as their pets, and one pet type they can have are tenacity pets, which will act as their own personal tank. Tenacity pets will take the aggro of your targets and cause them to attack it instead of you, letting your pet take all the damage while you stay out of trouble and deal damage from afar. Both Beast Mastery and Marksmanship Hunters are a strong choice for beginners, but just be mindful that Survival Hunter is not a ranged DPS spec, so maybe avoid this one at first if you're new to the game. Another ranged DPS class that gets a range of pets to play with are Warlocks, and again, Warlocks can learn to summon a Void Lord which will act as their tank pet, helping them to stay alive and not have to worry about enemies attacking them directly. Of all the Warlock specs to choose as a beginner, I would probably recommend Destruction over Demonology or Affliction, simply because the playstyle is more intuitive and easier to get the hang of. Demonology involves summoning a bunch of different demons that deal damage for you, and Affliction is all about dealing damage over time with a bunch of curses. Destruction is simply a case of applying damage over time every so often, generating soul shards with their abilities, and spending those soul shards on big damage abilities, and then it's a rinse and repeat. Another great ranged DPS class for beginners I would say are mages, specifically frost mages. Frost mages are great at slowing down their targets and freezing them in place, making them much better at avoiding damage because their targets are usually dead before they can reach them. The reason I would not recommend a fire mage is that their playstyle is incredibly fast and incredibly proc based, which takes a lot of practice to master, and the majority of their damage comes from executing their burst window properly, so messing that up can be demotivating for new players while they're learning the ropes. As for arcane mages, I wouldn't recommend them because they are the only DPS spec in the game that has to play according to their mana. They can deal good amounts of damage and are very strong when played well, but as a newbie to WoW, learning how to spend and save mana effectively can be a big ask on top of learning the ins and outs of the game itself, so sticking with Frostmage allows you to play more safely, not have to worry about procs or fast-paced play, and also not have to worry about spending or saving mana. Of course, those are just some of my recommendations for new players based on what I have found since I started playing WoW all the way back in 2008. But if you have any additions to the list of classes you would recommend as a new player, or even classes you would avoid playing as a beginner, be sure to comment them down below. Thank you for watching, and if you're a new player to WoW, I hope there was something helpful in this video for you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you again very, very soon. Bye!